thank you for being here. I've just lost a bet because we thought there were only going to be 10 people here, so the sweepstake was lost and it's cost me money, so you win some, you lose some. I'm going to look at trying to put some dollar figures to a disease in Africa, trypanosomosis, or trypanosomosis as it's now called. For those of you who don't know, and one never knows with these things, it's a major, it's called sleeping sickness in people. It is also called cattle sleeping sickness, I guess. It's a major economic problem in Africa, especially in cattle and for cattle owners. It costs billions in lost production, particularly for the poorest rural farmers and pastoralists. It's carried by quite a lot of species of tsetse flies, which are pretty nasty things, as you can see. Anybody who's been bitten by one won't forget it. The slightly complicated thing about trying to deal with trypanosomosis is there are various different ways you can do it. And the most likely one is actually to control the vector. And there are many different ways to control the vector itself. The other complicating factor is that, as Tim alluded to, there are lots of different ways of keeping livestock, particularly in developing countries. But if you're going to plan or strategize any sort of wide-scale control, you do need to estimate how much it's going to cost, how much you're going to get out of doing it. And unless you can do that, and actually one of the easiest ways, or one of the best ways of doing that is to provide a map so you can target it as well, you're in danger of making some quite nasty mistakes, and the history's been littered with such things. If you're going to try and look at the economics of getting rid of a disease, particularly trypanosomosis, you need quite a lot of information to go with it. You need a One Health approach, which, for those of you who don't know what that is, means you don't just look at disease, you don't just look at human or animal disease, you look at everything you can, the ecology, the entomology, the economics. It's another word for multidisciplinary. You need to be able to extrapolate measurements which are more than likely in developing countries to have pretty large gaps in them, and you need to have clever tricks to go from measurements through, in this case, modelling to maps. And I've got a little M3 logo up there to stop me having to repeat that, and you'll see on the subsequent slides where that little logo occurs. There has been a process of going from measurements that we know through modelling to maps. We need to know about the vector and cattle distributions, obviously. We need to know or appreciate the fact that things change over time, and so that particularly the change in cattle numbers, and in this case over 20 years for the economic modelling. And of course you need to know where, in a theoretical case, with the removal of the vectors, i.e. you've controlled the disease, and the other case, assuming that there is no removal of vectors. We need to estimate the costs of each type of control. We need to estimate the benefits you get from each type of control scenario. And that gives you a benefit-cost ratio. You divide one by the other, and it needs to be at a fairly high resolution so that you can actually use it for planning and strategizing. The costs of the different sorts of vector control, we found out largely from literature review, but also from having folks in the various countries concerned. This was our study area here, was the Horn of Africa. Actually going out and finding out how much it actually cost to do these things, asking people, ministries, we had questionnaires, we had quite a complicated set of ways of doing this. But most of it was from literature review, and it's a long and venerable and fairly argumentative topic, it has to be said. But we also need to know where the cattle densities are, where the cattle are, and where the tsetse flies are. And also appreciate actually that the costs don't necessarily vary by geography, i.e. where it is. It's more in relation to the number of cattle and where the vectors are. And Tim will have told you, has told you earlier on this morning, that we know where the cattle are, or at least we think we know where the cattle are on the left there, because we've spent quite a lot of time turning measurements into models. And in the same way, we've been modelling tsetse distributions on the right-hand side here for some years now. It's where a lot of the spatial modelling techniques were initially developed about, God knows, before God was invented, really. Certainly before trains. As far as the species, Tetsi species are concerned, we've got 6 species, so we do tend to divide them into 2 groups. One is riverine, they live near rivers, and one is savanna, so they live in savannas, and they do slightly different things, and they cost slightly different. It costs different amounts to control them. In terms of vector control strategies, you can either trap them. Well, firstly, you can either control them, which means doing the same thing over and over again for a long period, or you can try and eliminate them, which means doing something and then you get rid of them forever. And elimination strategies, once control scenarios, tend to be something you repeat every 3 or 4 years, or continuously, whichever. You can trap them, attract them first, then trap. You can pour insecticide all over cattle. You can, for the control, you can spray them from the air by flying at suicidally low altitudes, I have to say, mostly at night. They're very clever people, those. And for control, you can, there's chemoprophylaxis available, which works quite well. For elimination, there's an additional technique, sterile insect release, which has been on the cards for quite some time, but it has to follow the other techniques, either pour-ons, the insecticide treated, or aerial spraying. So there's a fair range of things you can do, and they all, of course, have different costs. They do indeed have different costs, and you don't really need to know about this, apart from the fact that we linked the costs to either the number of cows, so costs per bovine for each treatment, for example, and we made assumptions about how many treatments over a 20-year period, differences in costs according to density of the cattle, and some of the costs were just straight per unit area of land. I've given you here an example just for control. We'll talk about, we did it for elimination as well. You'll notice that the costs are actually quite variable, from 86 per bovine present at the start of the period through to 2,500 per square kilometre for aerial spraying. That's and I'm not the economist, as James pointed out. Alex, she did most of the economics, so I take it on faith to a degree. But the key is we're linking costs, which don't vary hugely by geography, to things we can map, either to just the area itself or to the cattle for which we know the distributions. And that gives you a map or a series of maps for each different method. We'd never really done this, well, nobody had ever really done this before. Nobody ever really done this before. It was quite gratifying to see that we get spatial patterns that make some sort of sense. For trypanosides, for example, you can see on top left there, you can see a nice spatial patterns, whereas for others, like aerial spraying, because it's a constant cost, you basically fly up and down, it doesn't vary too much according to where you are, you get a straight constant cost throughout. So producing the costs takes relatively few steps, and it's not dependent, we think, on the largely not dependent on the type of cattle rearing. The benefits, on the other hand, is the benefits you get out depends on whether you're an agropastoralist or a pastoralist or a mixed farmer or different types of production. So it's a rather more complicated thing to do. We have to first work out top there where the systems are, different production systems. We then have to realize that the cattle populations will increase either in the presence or without Tetsi. We make those two model assumptions. We also have to realize, see on the right, that cattle populations don't just stay where they are. As they increase in density, they will probably have to spread out into less stocked areas. And then we combine those, we assign values to the cattle or to their products, and then we can map those as benefits from the difference of producing models with and without Tetsi present. So there's quite a lot of different inputs. In terms of the systems, we need to know whether they're agropastoralist, pastoralist, or mixed, and that's a combination of measurements and then modelling that again. We need to know where some of the more specialist production systems are that aren't geography dependent, like the presence of dairy cattle, for example, largely in Kenya and Uganda. And again, that was something that we had some information and we then had to model it again in the same sort of ways. But for some other things, particularly for traction for oxen, which are a very important part of the more intensive systems, or rather the less extensive systems. They're a major contributor to the value of livestock because they do the cultivation, essentially. We had to map those as well. And we ended up with 12 different, 12 different systems in that combination map down there, for which we produced different types of benefit, or different levels of benefits accrued through the potential removal of the fly. And that's a schematic to show you what it is. The sorts of things we assign values to, the values of milk, the economic benefits or the economic profits, if you like, made by draft animals, how many animals got sold, slaughtered, so on and so forth. For each of the different systems, we had different levels of mortalities, different growth rates, different yields of milk, blah, 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 blah. It's quite a complicated system. And we produced two sets of herd models, i.e. to model the change in cattle densities, one for just growth and staying, and one for the cattle that actually moved because of overstocking or whatever else. In terms of looking at the spread of populations, the more dynamic aspects of movement, which Simon alluded to earlier on, they obviously don't stay in the same place if populations increase, and they certainly don't stay in the same place if you get new land created through the clearance of tsetse, because there's a whole lot of new stuff out there you can go and live in. It involved looking at the, obviously where the tsetse were, where they're likely to have spread into cleared areas, where the overstocking was likely to happen, and that is, if any of you are ecologists or understand the difficulties of carrying capacity, that can be a fairly long and involved process. And then, of course, identifying the destinations to which cattle spread. And we use an essentially mixture of a diffusion and stochastic long-distance spread model pioneered by Marius down there, who will speak next on a slightly different topic. And so on the left, we give you some sort of indication of where the overstocking is likely to happen, and on the right, we give an indication of where things spread. And the green bits are where they would spread to if you remove the tsetse fly. That gives you the benefit map that Tim showed earlier on. And again, it's quite nice to see that there is a spatial variation in there. You can pick out different benefits in different places. The range of benefits that we calculated was anywhere between 10 and about 15,000 per square kilometre. It really is quite a lot. And the total for all of that is, for this area alone, over a 20-year period, it's about $2.5 billion. That's a lot of money. So take that all the way to the whole of Africa, and you've got really quite a lot of money. So we could afford to spend quite a lot on this, if you felt like it. So we've got the costs, and we've got the benefits over a 20-year period, and to get the cost-benefit ratio, you just divide one by the other. Luckily, it doesn't take too much to do that. And what you end up with is a series of 4 maps, in this case for the control scenarios. Notice how many of them actually use that measurements to models to maps pathway to actually fill in some of the data. And again, you will see that the benefit-cost ratios are really variable according to the method. So, for example, for insecticide-treated cattle, they're more brown, the top right-hand one, so the cost-benefit ratio is really quite high. For some of them, the trypanosides are reasonably high, but there are areas in others, in the ITC one, the top right, where it's grey, where it's actually not applicable to use that method because there simply aren't enough cattle to do it. One of the other things to note here is the yellow bits. The yellow bits are where you get cattle that move out of areas because they are overstocked into areas outside the tsetse belt. So there are benefits to this, to removing tsetse outside the tsetse belt. And of course, if you look at that, if you say, right, you get benefits, but there's no costs because they didn't have to control the tsetse, you've got an infinite benefit-cost ratio. Now, I said we did control and elimination. So there's elimination, there's control, and we just take we'll just take one example. I've looked at the traps, the benefit cost of traps there in this blow up on the right, and you'll see it's largely greenish with a few red bits. If you look at the one for elimination, it's much more brown with a few green bits. Now, what that means is that the benefit cost ratios for elimination are significantly improved over the benefit cost ratios for just control. Yeah, of course. So, what are the conclusions? A, the methods more or less work, we think. It's possible to do this, which we didn't know at the beginning. B, you need to keep the rates conservative so we don't get too much in the way of overestimation. And also, we reckon that this is a method that we can use for other diseases and indeed other areas. And in terms of looking at it in a spatial way, we can find clear spatial patterns. There are high potential areas with decent benefit cost ratios, but in low cattle densities, it can be low or even negative, but outside TETSI areas, it can be infinite. We haven't added the possible impact of human trypanosomosis, obviously, on human trypanosomosis. Elimination is theoretically better than control. Trypanosides do best in low-density areas, traps and targets in savanna but not riverine. Poron's pretty good all round. Aerial spraying is rapid and cost-effective. And even SIT, sterile insect technique, whilst the most expensive, there are places where it's profitable if other methods don't work and if elimination is practical. Thank you.